Hello and welcome to Spencer's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about the classics I want to read this year. Now, I know that that's how I've titled the video for simplicity's sake, but these are not all of the classics I want to read in 2020. These are just the classics that I want to read that I've had on my bookshelf. So books that I already own that I would quite like to get through in 2020. And the reason why I want to really reduce my TBR down this year is because I am moving countries and my TBR's gotten out of control, and I really want to make sure that when it gets to moving time, I have read through most of the books on said TBR so that I don't have to carry them all around with me. I have a lot of books on this TBR, and considering that my 2019 reading year wasn't as prolific as I had hoped, I'm not assuming that I will actually get through all of these classics, but I'm gonna have a good go at it. So let's get started straight away, because I have the slight suspicion that this is going to be a bit of a longer video. Before I get into the books, here briefly again is my personal definition of a classic. Any book that was written before 1960. So that is how I define classics for myself. Let me start with the books that I am currently reading. The first one is Thomas Mann's Der Zauberberg, or The Magic Mountain in English translation. And I have just started this as a read-along with Andrea from Infinite Text and a group of other lovely people who have joined us in reading this book in January. Although, at the time of recording, I am awfully behind. I should be about 200 pages in now, and I'm only 55 pages in. So we'll see how that's going. This, so far anyway, is the story of a young man who arrives at a sort of clinic in the Swiss Alps, and then what happens to him there. And this was published in the 1920s. And this is a true German classic, which is why I am reading it, despite it being huge and complex and difficult to read, because I've never read any Thomas Mann novel before, and he really is one of the German literary greats, and I want to discover that for myself and see if I like his style. The other book that I'm currently reading is and I've been reading this for months, so I'm so bored of showing this on camera, I just want to get this done with. And it's A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, and I am about halfway. Yes, well, more than halfway. I'm about 85 pages out of a 150-page book, and this is, of course, a dystopian classic, which is why I am fighting my way through it, despite it being quite a difficult read, but it is also quite a rewarding read, so I'm not going to DNF this. I am going to make it through. It might just take me another couple of months. So far, I can't say I'm enjoying it exactly, but I'm certainly getting some value out of it, and it's fascinating to see a mid-century dystopian novel that is really quite different from the other mid-century dystopian novels I have read so far. The most difficult barrier for me is really the language, because it is, I mean, you have to focus on it. That's the thing. You can't just read this while the TV's on in the background with a purring cat on your lap. It just doesn't work like that. You have to focus. You have to reread sentences. You have to really think about the meaning of what you're reading. Kind of similar to the Thomas Mann book, which is why I'm making my way through those quite slowly. Then a book that's been kind of on, I guess, on a break, you know, when you put a book aside and you're like, well, I can pick this up again in a few months, is Silas Marner by George Eliot. And I started this one in October 2019, so in October, and I made it about, I don't know, I think 60 pages or so, and then I just put it aside and didn't pick it up again. So I think when I pick this up again, I might start from the beginning, just so I have the whole first third of the book as context as well. And this so far is about a man. It's a historical novel. I think it's set sometime in the 18th century. A young man who has all of his treasure stolen from him at the point that I'm at. This is the point where I should mention that I never do much research about books I haven't read yet, so sorry about that. Now let's get into the classics that I've got on my TBR that I'd quite like to get into after I'm done with these three, and these are in no particular order, maybe vaguely alphabetical because that's how I pulled them off my TBR. But let's start with Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. I bought this one for Victober. I found it in a charity shop. You know what? I think every single book on this TBR I found in a charity shop, except the ones that were gifted to me. So I found this one and I thought I'll give Gaskell another go. I read North and South in Victober 2018 and really didn't like it. I'm sorry, I know it's many people's favourite Gaskell, but I really didn't like it. So I am happy to give her another go because I'm sure that there is quality in her writing that I just didn't see when I read North and South. Obviously, it's entirely likely that she is just not the author for me, and that's fine. But I'm not going to make that decision until I've read at least one more work by her. Cranford is a novella, I believe. It's quite short. It's not a full-length novel. Another Victorian classic that I have on my TBR is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. Both Jude the Obscure and Cranford I am saving for this year's Victober, so I'm not going to get to those before then. And this is obviously one of Hardy's most well-known novels, and he is one Victorian author that I haven't actually read yet. So I'm quite excited to explore his writing as well, because he is much loved by many here on BookTube and beyond. Then we're sticking with the Victorians for now. I have Bram Stoker's Dracula, a classic that I cannot believe I haven't read yet, and I'm quite excited about this one. Again, saving this one, like all of the other Victorian novels on here, for Victober. This next book was actually gifted to me by my friend and guest spinster Robin, and I believe she inherited this book, but she doesn't really read classics, so she gave it to me, and it is The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope. I knew this. And again, another Victorian author who I have not yet read. There's definitely a theme here. I'm really looking forward to exploring all these new Victorian authors in this year's Victober Readathon. Let's move on to something non-Victorian for a change, and this is a 1932 release, a German classic called Das Kunstseidene Mädchen by Irmgard Keun. I'm not sure what the English translation is. I feel like it might be The Artificial Silk Girl, but check the description box because I will put the full English title in there as well. And this is one of the few German classics that are kind of published and easy to find in bookshops that are written by women, which is a big shame. But again, she is an author who I haven't yet read. In fact, I didn't even know about her in school because all we ever read was Goethe, and I am looking forward to exploring this early 20th century classic. It is often described as a kind of feminist classic. Keun is often compared to Virginia Woolf, and I read Virginia Woolf for the first time in 2019, so it'll be interesting to see if those parallels make sense, or if someone just took two female authors from the early 20th century and compared them to each other, because that's what people do. Sticking with German literature from the early 20th century, I have a collection of poems by Bertold Brecht, and I am not the biggest poetry reader. Hello, Minerva. Neither is Minerva. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to make my way through this. Minerva, stop that. At least say hello. Hello. Right. Next up, A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, the only E.M. Forster novel that I haven't yet read, and I'm kind of saving this one. And a few people have expressed their interest in buddy reading this with me, so if you are one of those people, then just get in touch with me again and we'll sort something out, because I don't want to finish with reading E.M. Forster. I don't want this to be the last of his novels that I've yet to discover, but unfortunately, unless they find some sort of hidden manuscript, it is, and I really want to save this for a special moment. Next up is another mid-century classic, and this one is William Golding's Lord of the Flies, a book that divides opinion. I have to say the cover is really not that appealing. but there's something about this book that intrigues me. People either seem to love or hate it. Actually, most people that I remember having opinions on this hate it. So we'll see if it is for me or not. Maybe this is the right time where I should mention my resolution for this year to DNF books if I really, really, really am not enjoying them and I'm not getting any value out of them, to just put them aside and pick up a different book. Oh, this is one that I'm quite excited about, and it is Robin Hood by Henry Gilbert. Now, this is the lesser known early 20th century retelling of the Robin Hood myth. The more well-known one is, I think, the late 19th century version by Howard Pyle. I love the Robin Hood myth. It's a story that I grew up with. My brother actually really enjoyed reading the Howard Pyle version. I never read that because he was hogging the book, so I never got to read that, but we all grew up with the Disney versions or various other retellings. It's a fun proto-socialist tale. It's got a lot of aspects to it that I really love. Not exclusively the stealing from the rich bit, but I like stories about survivalism. I like stories about people living in the woods. And that is 100% because I know that I wouldn't survive in the wild for 5 minutes, but I like reading about those kinds of things, and knights and maidens and all of that kind of stuff. And this is a lovely illustrated edition, so I'm looking forward to that. This is possibly the only classic that my friend in Westminster, Robin, actually recommended to me, because, like I said earlier, she doesn't read classics, and yet she has good memories of reading Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. And this is, I believe, early 20th century? Yeah, 1938, so almost mid 20th century. And I don't really know what it's about, except that it's some sort of hard-hitting social commentary or something. It smells really good though, in a kind of musty way. I like that. Sticking with fairy tales. Robin Hood isn't really a fairy tale, but this is a collection of Brothers Grimm fairy tales in German, also illustrated, and this has got some absolute classics in it, like Puss in Boots, but it also has some stories that I had never heard of, and being German, obviously I grew up with Grimm fairy tales, and I know quite a lot of them, but it'll be interesting to explore the lesser well-known ones in this collection as well. I imagine that I'll be reading this as a kind of either like a bedside read, where I can just read one fairy tale a night, or maybe a morning read, where I can read one fairy tale while having my morning tea or coffee. This is the only French classic on my TBR, and it is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. This is a German translation. The original is in French, so, I don't mind whether I read it in German or English. This is the version I have. I do like the musical, okay? It's got some catchy tunes in it. The story's a bit messed up, but I am looking forward to seeing how much this differs from the original, from the novel that the musical is based on. Oops. I would blame this on Minerva, but I definitely just knocked the camera there. We are moving to one author who I recently discovered, as in 2 years ago, but I haven't read much more of, and that is Daphne du Maurier. And I have 2 books on my TBR of hers. My Cousin Rachel, which for some reason you can find in every single charity shop in the UK. There's like at least one copy of My Cousin Rachel. And then Jamaica In, which I'm kind of more excited about Jamaica In than about My Cousin Rachel, because this is one that gets recommended a lot on BookTube as well. Obviously the book that I have read by Daphne du Maurier is Rebecca, and I did a whole video about my reaction to it, which I'll link in the description box if you're interested. Then we go to Russia for a mid-century classic, Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, and I have never read a Russian classic before. I know when you say Russian classic you usually think a little bit earlier than this, which was from the 1950s, I believe. I know nothing about what this is about, but I know a lot of people love this book, so I saw it in a shop and it was 99p, so I bought it. And I mean, it says on top, one of the greatest love stories ever told, so that's a pretty high bar there. we're almost done. I've got one American classic. Is this actually the first American book that I'm talking about? Might be. Where's William Golding from? Anyway, this is Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I've never read Huckleberry Finn, and I've not read Tom Sawyer either. We'll see. I don't really have that high expectations of this because I have read a lot of kind of negative reviews, critical reviews of this book. And yeah, I'm just curious to see what I make of this novel. And finally, I've saved the oldest book for the end. And this is a 18th century classic, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. I just feel like this is one of those stories that will help me understand maybe some of the genre of dystopian fiction. I'm very interested in dystopian classics, and a lot of the literature around dystopian fiction references Gulliver's Travels as one of the earliest examples of it. And I know it isn't quite what we think of today as dystopian, but I'd still be interested to read this in that context. A few years ago, I read a Mary Shelley book that's also considered the first dystopian novel called The Last Man, which is about the ultimate demise of humanity. And that was very fascinating. That was from the 1830s. So this one is going back a little bit before then. I think this was late 18th century. Oh, it wasn't late 18th century. It was published in 1726. So that will be a very interesting read. I really want to delve a little bit more into 18th century literature, going back in time a little bit further and look at some of the earliest novels as we know them. So those were the books that I have on my physical TBR that are classics that I'd quite like to get to in 2020. And I have no illusions, I'm not going to get to all of them, but I am quite interested in all of them. I'm quite excited to read all of them. And I think I've got a good selection for Victober as well. I'm definitely going to save all of the Victorian novels for Victober. And I'm really looking forward to broadening my classics horizon in 2020. Let me know if you want to recommend any of these books to me, if you want to warn me about any of these books. I mean, I'm going to get to them anyway, but if there are any books here that you really dislike, then I'd quite like to know why. And let me know which classics you are excited about to get to. Let me know which classics you are excited to get to. Let me know the classics about which, you know what I mean. Thank you for watching. Bye.